Welcome to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and in this podcast, we talk about everything that is history. So, in this space, I'm going to talk about the concept of property in ancient India and what are the different types of property ownership which we see in ancient India. So, one question which I think when we study this concept of property in ancient India come to our mind is that why should we study in the first place? So, uh, this question of how ownership of land in ancient India evolved and what was the characteristic of the landed property is important for us to study because it can provide us information about the social structure of ancient India and how social structure evolved throughout the ancient Indian history. So in that way, I think it is important for us to know and learn about this how ownership of land existed in India, or what type of ownership existed in ancient India. Now, so we have to study this concept of ownership. But when we study this concept, we find that there are certain problems which scholars face when they try to understand the concept of property in ancient India. So, the first major problem which historians and scholars face is that we do not have any archival material or let's say business records or documents related to property law. So, because of the lack of these types of document, it is very hard for us to say how the landed property or the concept of landed property evolved. Now, when we look at other texts, we find that, for example, the famous text Kautilya's Arthashastra, there are some information about the ownership of land. But here, what we find is that, as we all know, the main focus of Kautilya was not on how the concept of ownership existed during the time when he was writing his Arthashastra. For him, his focus was on the organization of royal economy and also about the organization and administration of the royal lands. So his focus was on these topics. It was not on the private lands. So this is one problem which we face when we try to gather information from Kautilya's Arthashastra. So the fact that we do not have archival materials or text related to text on the private property law, so we have to refer to religious text, mainly the dharma sutras and the dharma shastras. So we find that in these types of text, although they are religious texts, there are also information about the ownership of land and what are the various rules and jurisdictions that are related to the property. So we have to look at these dharma sutras and dharma shastras. And when like if you would know, if you had noticed, you will find that I am basically talking about literary sources only. So when we talk about epigraphical sources or inscriptional data, we find that it is only after 1st century AD we have some inscriptional evidence. So in order to know about what was the concept of property before 1st century AD, it is only the literary sources that we have. So these are some of the problems which scholars face when they try to study the concept of private property in ancient India. So we should keep in mind that whatever the understanding which scholars are providing us about the concept of property in ancient India, these are the problem which historians face are that there are not enough sources. So this we should keep in mind, because in some cases you will find that we have to rely on speculations. There are no hard facts in certain matters. So this we should keep in mind. Now, uh, coming to this whole question of ownership of land, we find that from ancient period onwards, like from the Vedic period to the period of, let's say, the post Gupta period, there are mainly three types of ownership that can be seen. The first is the communal ownership, where where a community has the ownership on a particular land, so the individual does not have any ownership. The second is the individual or private ownership. So here what we find is that in the individual ownership, a single person owns the entire land. So the common or the most obvious example of this would be the head of the family. So the head of the family owns the entire land which the family has. So this would be an example of individual ownership. Then we have the royal ownership. In royal ownership, I think the name is quite is easily explained by the fact that here it is the king who owns the entire land. So these three types of private property or the ownership which historians have argued existed in ancient India. Now, what you will see when you look at the different scholars who have studied this topic, some have argued that it was the community or communal ownership that was the dominant form of ownership in ancient India. Some have argued that it was the individual ownership that was the dominant ownership, and some have argued the royal ownership. Now here I will not discuss the opinions of different scholars, but I will give you just a brief overview of some of the main conclusions which some scholars have drawn. So when we talk about firstly the communal ownership, today the consensus is that it was in the ancient times, particularly in the Vedic period, we find the evidence of communal ownership. Particularly in the early Vedic period, we see that it was the clan that enjoyed right over major resources such as land and herds. So at this time, there was no concept of private property. But by the time of the later Vedic period, we see that there is some change that can be observed. So at this time, we find that the clan had a general right over land, but it was now the extended family that had ownership over the land. So in a way, we can say that the ownership size or the size of the community is reducing in this period, and although the size of the community which owned a particular land is reducing, here earlier it was it was the whole clan which had ownership on of a particular land, but now it is the extended family that has the ownership. So the size is decreasing, but still there was no institute of private ownership that existed. So but there was a change that can be seen. So this is what we see in the case of early and later Vedic period. Now there are some scholars who have argued that, for example, Lallanji Gopal in his article has argued that we can see that there are certain evidence which suggest that there was some type of private property that existed in the Vedic period. So he mentions that in the Rig Veda we find that there is term like Urvarasa, Urvarapati, Urvarajit, Kshetrasa, Kshetrapati. So these terms suggest that there is certain element of private ownership that existed during the Vedic period. Then in the later Vedic text like Atharva Veda, Taittiriya Samhita or Chandogya Upanishad, this private ownership has become more clear. This sense of private ownership has become more clear. So this is the opinion of Lallanji Gopal, but I will not go much into this. Coming back to the communal ownership, what we see is that we have seen that in the later Vedic period the size of the community is decreasing, but this is not certainly this change is not certainly felt throughout the different parts of northern India. For example, if we look at the Kshatriya republics or Ganasanghas of the 6th century BC, what we see here is that, particularly in the case of the Kshatriya republics, we find that the concept of individual ownership did not existed in the Kshatriya republics. Here it was the Kshatriya clan that had the complete ownership of land, and the produce that was, the produce from the land was distributed to the Kshatriya families and also on the dependents of these families. So the ownership here is communal. And there are some scholars who have argued that when you look at how in the Buddhist Sangha, the food that is collected from donation and how it was distributed. So this mechanism, which is present in the Buddhist text, that how monks should distribute this food that is collected through donations. So this mechanism, in some scholars have argued, was borrowed from how the Kshatriya Ganasanghas distributed the produce that was brought from that was collected from the land. So there is this argument that in the Kshatriya Gana of the 6th century BC, it was the communal ownership that existed. But in the monarchies, we find that there was no communal ownership. It was individual ownership that was present. And what we also see is that in the Hindu legal texts like the Dharma Shastras and the Dharma Sutras, they do not refer much to the communal ownership aspect of the land. So, in a way, we can say that this communal ownership existed in the early period, but by the time of, let's say, the end of the Kshatriya Ganas, there is not much reference which we find about the communal ownership. So we have now left with the other two concepts. So first is the private ownership and the second is the royal ownership. So what we see is that, particularly during the time of the Buddha, in the Pali canon there are terms like Khettapati, Khettasamika, or Vathupati. So these terms, which suggest that there was, which these terms were basically used for individuals who cultivated their own land. So in these Pali works, we can see that there is a developed sense of individual ownership. Now, another point which we find in these Pali texts is that there are reference of boundaries that were set up to distinguish the plots of land that were cultivated by different owners. So this the setting up of boundaries suggests that there was a sense of private ownership or individual ownership, and these boundaries suggested that a particular individual held a particular land. So there is this reference. Then we find that land was classed with cattle and other movable property of a householder. So the fact that land is included in the list of property suggests that at this time there was this concept of private ownership. Then we find that, for example, if you look at the famous example of Anath Pindika, Ambapali or Amrapali or Jivika, who gifted lands to the Buddhist to the Buddhist Sangha, suggest that there was this suggest that they owned their land, so that is why they were able to gift this land to the Buddhist Sangha. So here also we can see that there is this sign of private ownership that can be seen. And interestingly, in the Digha Nikaya, we find that reference of stealing of another's plot is mentioned. So here again, the example can be used to to say that there was this concept of private ownership that had started to appear in the 6th century BC. And generally, what we see is that when we look at the ancient literature as a whole, we find that in the ancient literature there is this distinction between ownership and tenure or use of the particular land. So what we find is that ownership was denoted with the pronoun swam or once, which means once, and terms like swatra, swamya, swamin, swamitva, and other terms are used to suggest ownership. So, for example, if we look at Dharma Sutra, we find that here Dharma Sutra tells us that an individual can become a property owner. Here, the term which is used is swamin. So, an individual can become a property owner by inheritance, purchase, division, seizure, or finding. So, these are the different ways through which an individual can become a property owner. And the term here which is used is swamin. Now, the same term also appears in Kautilya. Here, what we find is that when Kautilya is dealing with the dispute about the sale of land, he uses this term, and he uses this term also when he talks about a person driving cattle through the field without owner's permission. So here the owner of the land is called swamin. So we can say this that there is this term swamin and other terms which I have mentioned was used to suggest a private owner of a land. And Kautilya also interestingly discusses this term when he talks about the encroachment upon the field. So here again we find this term which is mentioned for a private owner. Now, when we look at the term which is used for tenure or use, we find that here it is the verb bhuj, which means to make use of or to enjoy, which is used, and its derivatives like bhukti, bhog, upbhog, etc. are used for tenure or use. So, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, there is this interesting discussion which is about the leasing of the land. So, here Kautilya tells us that a person who is using or basically cultivating the land in the absence of original owner uh, will able to own the particular land which he using if the own only after 20 years. So basically, suppose if you are using a particular land which does not belong to you, but you are using it for, let's say, for more than 20 years, it will become your property. So here Kautilya mentions that. So there is this period of 20 years which one should occupy, one had have to occupy in order to claim ownership. And and he also says that uh, even the relatives or Brahmins don't have the right to occupy the land in the absence of the owner. So, if suppose an owner of a particular land is absent, if you are cultivating that particular field, uh, so if the owner does not appear, in the first 20 years, this particular field will become your property. But if he appears before 20 years, then you cannot claim that this was your land because you are cultivating it. So here in this reference, it is clear that there is this strong sense of ownership that we can see. Now, something similar appears in Manusmriti, and here in Manusmriti we see that uh, tilled field is listed along with house, pond, garden as the principal categories of property of an individual. So in Manusmriti also we can clearly see that there is this private ownership that existed. And Manu also talks about fine that should be imposed on another person who had illegally possessed a particular field of land. So, in these two examples, it is clear that there is this sense of private ownership that is present in Manusmriti. In the late Dharmashastras, we see that there is this legality of ownership has become quite complex. So Yajnavalkya Smriti, in Yajnavalkya Smriti, it tells us that bhog is used for use. So bhog or use of land acquires legal force only when there is a clear and official confirmation that is present. So here the official confirmation would be that you have a particular document that tells us that you are using a particular field, but you are not you are not the owner. So this official confirmation should be there if you are using a particular field of land. And in Narad Smriti clearly tells us that if if the legal confirmation is not there, then the possession of property could be regarded as theft. So here we can clearly see that in the later Dharmashastras, there is this complex rule regarding tenureship that has emerged. But these complex rules were not there in the early case. It only emerged with the later Dharmashastra. So we are talking about the period of the Guptas or the post Gupta period. Earlier, what we find is that it was the customary law that existed. For example, if you look at Manusmriti, so in Manusmriti tells us that the field belong to him who clears the wood. And something similar is also present in the famous Buddhist text Milinda Panna. So Milinda Panna tells us that if a person who clears the wood gets the land as a result, and it also tells us that a person becomes the owner of the land. And here the term which is used is quite interesting, and the term which is used is bhumi samiko, which clearly means that bhumi swami. So bhumi swamiko, or the owner of the land, this person becomes the owner of the land when he makes the land usable, which means that he makes the land cultivable. So at this time, we find that in the case of Manusmriti and Milindapanna, this legal confirmation or legal system about the ownership had not developed yet. It is only with the later Dharmashastras we will see the emergence of a complex legal system surrounding the ownership of the land. Now, there is one question that comes to our mind when we look at text like Narad Smriti or Yajnavalkya Smriti, which mentions the legal title. So, the question would be that, let's say, what happens when there was no legal title? So, suppose you are using a particular land, but you do not have a legal title. So what are the rules that are mentioned in Narad Smriti or the later Dharma Shastras in general? So in Narad and Katyayan, we find that they tell us that if suppose a person does not have the title of a particular land and he is using the land, so it will be regarded as the ownership. The land will be regarded as his ownership, his land, only when there is this proof that three generations has occupied this particular land. So if a person who is cultivating a particular land and he does not have any legal titles of about a particular land, he has to show to the authorities that three generations of his were cultivating this land. So this was mechanism which these dharmashastras came up with in order to solve this conundrum. And it also so for example, another interesting case which we see is that, so in order to see how strong this sense of property was, so to see that, we can also look at the punishment that are prescribed to someone who harms the property. So if you look at, for example, Manu Smriti and Vishnu Smriti, we find that the theft of land was one of the four great sins. And in the Dharma Sutra, hell is mentioned as the punishment for someone who steals the land of someone else. So all this suggests that there is this strong sense of private ownership that was there in ancient India. Now, suppose, so if there is this strong sense of private ownership, what about the royal ownership? So, about the royal ownership, so scholars who have argued that in ancient India, it was the king who owned the entire land. So, scholars who have argued this point, they use the example of Medhatithi. Medhatithi, which all know, was the commentator of Manusmriti, and in his commentary on Manusmriti, he tells us that he calls the king as the master of the land. Now, this is mentioned in Manusmriti, but what we find is that in practice, the king was not the owner of all agricultural land. From the different texts which we have which are there when in the case of ancient India, we find that in these texts there is a distinction that is made between the entire territory of the state and private fields. And the entire territory of a particular state was not owned by a single individual. This included the king as well. So king did not have ownership on the entire territory of a particular state. The second point which we find in the case of in when we read these different ancient literatures is that there is this belief that is there in most texts, that a particular king received taxes not because he was the owner of all the lands. He received taxes because he protects his subjects. So the in lieu of the service which the king offers to his subjects, so the service is basically the protection. So because the king protects his subjects, these subjects pay him tribute. So this is the concept which we find in the ancient literature. It is clearly mentioned that in the ancient literature that the text which the king get by the cultivators was not because these cultivators were using the land which was owned originally by the king. They pay these cultivators pay taxes in return of the protection which the king provides. So king here is the defender of the right of the cultivators. So he protects their property, etc. So that is why the king is paid taxes. If you look at Kautilya, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, Kautilya clearly tells us that the taxes are levied because king protects the property of the subjects. So there's this great line that appears in Arthashastra that therefore even the hermits in the woods give him 1/6 of the harvest. So here he is talking about the king. So therefore even the hermits in the woods gave him 1/6 of the harvest, saying that it is the share of him who guards us. So those hermits or those monks who live in the jungle, they also pay 1/6 of whatever they are cultivating, not because the land was owned by the king, but because the king protects them. So this is the basic idea which we can see. So same idea also appears in the Dharma Sutras and the Dharma Shastras. If you look at Bodhayan Dharma Sutra, it tells us that there is this great line that let the king protect his subjects, receiving 1/6 as remuneration. So 1/6 of the produce is an important percentage which appears throughout the Indian literature, ancient literature particularly. And sometimes the term which appears is Shad Bhag. Uh, Shad is clearly sixth and Bhag is portion. So 1/6 portion is there. And if you look at Ramayana and Mahabharata, for instance, here sometimes we find that the king is also called Shadbhagin, which means receiver of 1/6. So 1/6 is the one can say traditional percentage of text that is fixed. Now, so this idea also, what we also find is that this idea is not restricted to the Hindu texts alone. If we look at, for example, the Buddhist texts, this idea also is there. So the right of the ruler to impose taxes on his subjects was not because the ruler was the owner of all land, but because as a king he was required to defend his subjects. Now, coming back to Kautilya, when he so one thing which we find when we read Kautilya's Arthashastra is that Kautilya is quite concerned about how he should ensure the uninterrupted flow of tribute. And there is this argument that one way through which Kautilya ensures that one way through which Kautilya ensures that this regular uninterrupted flow of tribute should continue is by making hard for people to become monks. Now, the reason I think is quite similar why Kautilya does not want the subjects of a particular king to become monks. Monks cannot be taxed, and if a person becomes a monk, then his land will not be tilled property. Will not be tilled properly. So that is why we find that, for example, there is a particular point in which Kautilya mentions that if a person wants to become a monk, even if he is old, he had to first take permission from judges. Then he advises the king that ascetics should not be allowed in villages. And all of these measures of Kautilya were there because he wanted to protect he wanted to ensure that a regular uninterrupted flow of tribute should be there. Now, now, if you look at Manusmriti, for example, there is this point about royal ownership and how the king had the right for taxes not because he owned the entire land can be seen in Manusmriti also. So Manu tells us that a king who does not protect his subjects but receives a share in the form of tax was declared to be one who took upon himself all the uncleanness of the people. So, if a king who does not protect his subjects but levies taxes, he also takes upon himself all the uncleanness of the people. Manu also declares this king as an immoral person, and he uses an interesting term for this king who does not protect his subjects but he levies taxes on them. So the term which is used is Bali Shad Bhag Taskara. Bali Shad Bhag, here it is clear that Shad Bhag is 1/6. So this term is, I think, quite interesting. Now, coming to the question of what about the instance where, so if you look at, for example, there are multiple inscriptions, and also in different texts, we find that there are instances where a king is giving taxes, is a king is giving land to Brahmins, to temples, or he is giving land to a particular Buddhist monastery. So scholars have so some people have pointed out that if there is this claim that the king does not had ownership of land, then how can you explain this phenomena where the king is giving land to Brahmins, temples, or different Buddhist monasteries? So what we find is that so the scholars who have pointed out that in ancient India there was no concept of entire ownership of land that was owned by the king. So these scholars have argued that here what we find is that in these cases is that these villages which were given to the Brahmins or the monks or temples, here it was not the land which was given. Instead, here it is the right to collect taxes which the king is passing to, let's say, the Brahmins or the monastery. So, so earlier it was the king who had the right to collect taxes, but now the king has passed this right to the temple or the monk or the Brahman. So this point I think is quite important because the king here is not transferring his property; he is transferring his right to collect taxes. Now, but we should also remember that there are certain instances where we can find where we find that in some there is also there are cases of monopoly where the state had monopoly over particular property. For example, the state did have monopoly over mineral deposits or salt. For example, in Dharma Sutra, it is mentioned that everything obtained from the mines belonged to the king. Manusmriti, for example, goes as far as to say that one half of buried treasure and metal belongs to the king. So, in this situation, what we find is that it was the king who was considered the owner of the land, both private and communal. So, we are basically talking about the mineral deposits or whatever that are found beneath the earth. So, in this case, the king had ownership both on private and communal lands. Mm. So this I think so it is quite clear here. And now another important point which I think we should also discuss is the fact that so there is this in Brihaspati Smriti, for example, if you look at Brihaspati Smriti, here it is clearly mentioned that even if an individual could not pay taxes, the king was not supposed to deprive this particular individual of his lands. So, uh, if let's say a particular subject could not able was not able to pay taxes to the king does not have the right to legally to legally own that particular land. So if a king occupies or possesses this land, then it would be considered illegal. So I think this also tells us how limited the royal ownership was in ancient India. Then there is another instance where it is mentioned that if a king takes land from someone and makes it over to another person as a sign of his favor, such a gift is not recognized as legal. So here again we can see that king does not had ownership of all the land. But there were some lands that were royal lands. So, this point I think we should make it clear that most of the lands in a particular state that were cultivated were owned by individuals, but there were also land in a particular state which was owned by the king, and these royal lands were called swabhumi. So if you look at Kautilya's Arthashastra, we find that there is a distinction that is made between Sita. Sita is a which is basically the land which the state owned, and the land which does not which was not owned by the king. So, for example, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, there is also an official who had the job of collecting and auditing the receipt from the royal lands, and he was called Sitadhyaksha. Then there was another person or official who was tasked to do the same on lands which were not which do not belong to the king. So this official was called Samaharta. So these two officials had so they had two different roles, and one usually one usually dealt with the royal lands, and the other dealt with the individual owned lands. So this is an important distinction which is made here. Now, what we find is that in the royal land, particularly, here the king enjoyed unlimited rights because he was the legal owner of the land. And uh, what we also find, for example, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, that in these royal lands there were also tenants who worked on the field. So these tenants were called Ardhasitika. And from Arthashastra, we see that a large proportion of the royal land. For example, there is this royal land also included the cultivable land, but royal land also included forests, uncultivated fields, and barren lands. So, if you look at the entire territory of a particular state, the royal land definitely had a larger proportion. But it is hard for us to say whether, in the case of cultivable area or cultivable lands, whether the king had a larger share. So this is a point which we cannot ascertain from the sources which we have available. Now, interestingly, in the royal lands which are not cultivated yet, Kautilya recommends that Shudra families should be settled who practiced agriculture. Now, interestingly, this does not mention that the Shudra families who would be settled in these uncultivated royal lands would become the owner of these lands. Here, it is clearly mentioned that these royal lands were not sold or mortgaged. They were granted only for personal use, and it was only granted for the lifetime of a particular individual. So let's say if someone was given a particular land that had to be cultivated, and this land was a royal land, then after the death of a particular of that person, this land would not pass on to the son of that person. It would go to the royal to the king. So this is an important point which we should remember, and it clearly suggests that these tenants who were tasked to cultivate the land were not the owners of the land. So basically, these individuals can be classified as state tenants in a way. Kautilya also tells us that these lands could be given to tutors, household priests, or Brahmins. And here, the produce of the land will belong to these individuals. The king would not take any share from it. So, in this way, we can say that here, in the earlier case where the state tenants state tenants were tasked to cultivate a particular land, they had to share certain portions from the production. But in the case of the Brahmins or tutors or household priests, the produce that was that was obtained was completely under the control of those who were granted that land. So there is this distinction which Kautilya makes between these two groups. And but we should also remember that here also, uh, these household priests, tutors, or Brahmins are not the owner of the land. They are also using the land, but in this case, the produce, they do not have to share a certain portion. They can keep all of the produce. But in the case of state tenants, they had to share certain portion. But at the end of the day, both of these are tenants. Now here, I think it is also worth mentioning that Kautilya also tells us that now before talking about this point, I think it is important to mention that what was the intention behind why Kautilya was giving these royal lands to these individuals. So if we look at, I think it is quite clear that the fact that these royal lands that are uncultivated are given to these families is mainly because the Kautilya wants to ensure that these families can make these lands cultivable, and after these lands are able to produce a let's say uh, if these families are able to produce enough crop from these lands, then they could become part of the cultivable lands. So basically, here these virgin lands, in a way, one could argue that by giving these lands, the state wanted to ensure increase in the cultivable lands. Also, it is important to note that there is also, when we talk about the royal lands, there is this impression that these royal lands were a one single unbroken mass. So this was clearly not true. What we find is that these royal lands were distributed in different regions, and sometimes they were situated alongside the lands of private ownership. So one example comes from Gautamiputra Satakarni's inscription. In this inscription, what Satakarni tells us that he orders a government official to give an ascetic a royal land or royal field in a gram. Now, this would suggest that this royal field or this royal land was situated within a village, or most likely, this royal land was surrounded by land which was not owned by the king. So, this is an interesting point which suggests that sometimes the royal land was situated in a village also. So these examples make it clear that, in my view, that in the Indian tradition, it was not the king who had right over all the lands. Now, there are, as I have already said earlier, that there are some differing opinions as well, and these mainly come from the non-Indian sources, where what we find is that these sources points to the direction that it was the king who owned the entire land. So, for example, if we look at Megasthenes writes that all of India is royal property and no private person is allowed to own land. Most likely, now scholars who have argued against this point of Megasthenes, they argue that most likely this assumption of Megasthenes uh, uh, was made because uh, firstly the scholars who have pointed out against this point that there was no royal ownership, they argue that this assumption of Megasthenes arised from his rationale that if the subjects are paying taxes to the king, then this would mean that the king owned all the lands. So Megasthenes saw that these people, the subject of the king, are giving the king tribute. So this clearly, this would mean for Megasthenes that it was the king who owned the entire land. But as we have seen in this whole talk, that the king had the right to collect taxes, not because he owned all the land, but because he was the protector of the subjects. So this distinction was there in the minds of Indians, but Megasthenes was not able to understand this distinction. And another view is that Megasthenes probably saw the surroundings of Patliputra, where most of the lands were royal lands. So, in royal lands, as we have seen earlier, there were families that worked, and these families had to pay certain portion to the king. So there is one argument that this point which Megasthenes make is basically comes from this observation of Megasthenes when he saw these royal lands. Now he Megasthenes had not seen what was happening in other part of the empire. So because of this, he has this conclusion that it was the king who owned the entire land. So now, in my view, if you look at, for example, Strabo tells us that, first of all, Strabo bases most of his views on Megasthenes. So Strabo mentions that in India, farmers were required. Farmers received only 1/4 of the crop from the working land. So, in my view, this observation of Strabo, which was based from Megasthenes, arose because Megasthenes had probably saw the what was happening in the royal lands. He could not see what was happening in the private owned lands, particularly in what was happening in the villages of the Mauryan Empire. So if we look at this picture, what we see is basically that the presence of land in India, particularly in ancient India, it most we can say that there was also land that was owned by individuals, and there were also land that was owned by royal families or king. So these two types of ownership can clearly be seen in ancient India. The communal ownership, as we have discussed, was there in the earlier case, but by the time of, let's say, the Mauryan period and after the Mauryan period, we find that there is little to no evidence to say that communal ownership also existed.